There are moments when history doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't arrive with sirens or headlines or breaking news banners. Sometimes it hides in plain sight. Sometimes it hides inside a joke. In 2015, The Simpsons aired what looked like just another episode mocking American politics. Nothing alarming, nothing serious, just satire, the kind the show had been doing for decades. And that's why almost everyone missed it. Almost. Years later, someone paused the episode at the exact right moment. Not out of fear, not out of expectation, just curiosity. And in that single frozen frame, something unsettling appeared. A man with unmistakable features. The posture, the hair, the expression, standing behind a podium. And behind him, a date. Not 2016, not 2020, not 2024. The date was 2025. At first glance, it seemed impossible. Coincidence, maybe. A stretch, surely. But the longer people looked at it, the harder it became to dismiss. Because The Simpsons had already done this before. Too many times. Events once laughed off as absurd had a habit of quietly becoming real. What made this frame different wasn't just the year. It was the precision, the timing, the emotional weight embedded in that image. It didn't feel like a random gag, it felt intentional, as if someone somewhere in the writer's room understood that history has cycles, and that some figures don't simply disappear when they lose power. This wasn't a prediction about winning an election. It was something deeper, something darker. It hinted at return, at unfinished business, at a story that hadn't reached its final chapter yet. What unsettled viewers most was the realization that the episode didn't treat this future lightly. There was no celebratory tone, no sense of relief. The imagery carried tension, instability, a feeling that something fragile was about to be tested. And that's where the discomfort truly begins. Because when satire stops feeling exaggerated and starts feeling familiar, it forces an uncomfortable question. What did they see that we didn't? What patterns were already visible long before the rest of us noticed them? This hidden frame wasn't screaming a message. It was whispering one. And whispers, when ignored, often become warnings too late to stop. As the episode moves forward, the clues don't disappear. They multiply, quietly, subtly, leading us deeper into a future that feels less fictional with every passing year. And that's where the real story begins. Once that hidden frame is noticed, it becomes impossible to unsee what comes next. The episode no longer feels like a harmless joke. It starts to feel layered, deliberate, almost cautious, as if the message had to be hidden in fragments rather than spoken out loud. The clues don't arrive dramatically. They pass quickly, buried inside background details most viewers were never meant to analyze. Headlines scroll across a television screen while characters talk over them. Jokes flash by in less than a second. And yet, one headline stands apart from the rest. Former president returns to power. Constitutional crisis looms. Nation holds its breath. It appears briefly. Too briefly for casual viewers. But long enough for those who pause, rewind, and look closely. The wording isn't exaggerated. It isn't absurd. It sounds disturbingly serious, almost restrained. And beneath that headline, a familiar face appears. Not named, not announced, but instantly recognizable. Later in the episode, another scene deepens the unease. Homer flips through a newspaper from the future, something the show has used many times for laughs. But this time, the joke doesn't land the same way. One headline freezes the moment. President declares national emergency. Opposition calls for impeachment. Country on the brink. The date printed at the top removes any remaining doubt. January 2025. That detail matters. Because January isn't a random month. It represents the beginning of a term. The moment when power has just been transferred. When optimism is supposed to be highest. Yet the image shows immediate instability. Immediate confrontation. A country already stretched to its limits before it has time to breathe. What's striking is what isn't shown. There's no clear villain, no clear hero, just chaos, confusion, institutions under pressure. The show isn't predicting a single event. It's illustrating a condition, a nation where every decision becomes explosive because trust has already collapsed. And then there's the rally footage, muted audio, subtitles only, a leader speaking to a crowd, eyes intense, posture rigid. The words are simple, but loaded. I'm back, and this time no one will stop us. There's triumph in the sentence, but also something colder, something unresolved. It suggests that the second rise to power isn't about governing, it's about settling scores, proving something, finishing something that was interrupted. Taken together, these scenes form a pattern, not a prophecy of exact actions, but a warning about atmosphere, about momentum, about what happens when political tension doesn't cool down, but accelerates. By the time the episode ends, the message feels clear. If this future arrives, it won't explode all at once. It will unravel quietly, headline by headline, decision by decision, until chaos no longer feels shocking, only familiar. And that realization leads directly into a more uncomfortable question. What kind of leadership emerges from that pressure? When a leader returns to power, the motivation is rarely the same as the first time. The excitement is gone. The novelty has faded. What remains is something more personal, unfinished business, unresolved wounds, a deep need to prove that defeat was never legitimate. That is exactly the emotional undercurrent the Simpsons seem to highlight when they portray this second rise. The tone shifts. The leader on screen is no longer seeking approval. He is no longer testing limits. He already knows where the boundaries are, and this time, he is willing to cross them. In one scene, the show lingers on a quiet moment. Night. The Oval Office. A single figure alone, staring at documents spread across the desk. There is no dialogue, no jokes, just an expression of absolute certainty. Not hesitation, not doubt, determination. The camera moves closer, just enough to reveal fragments of text. Words like executive order, unprecedented, permanent. And once again, the year appears. 2025. This moment is crucial because it reveals something deeper than policy. It reveals psychology. The show isn't suggesting impulsiveness. It's suggesting conviction, the dangerous kind. The kind that believes resistance is proof of righteousness. The kind that reframes opposition as betrayal, disagreement as sabotage. In this version of leadership, restraint is seen as weakness. Compromise becomes surrender. Tradition becomes an obstacle, rather than a safeguard. And the leader doesn't fear history's judgment because he believes history will eventually vindicate him. That belief changes everything. Because leaders who fear legacy hesitate. Leaders who trust institutions respect limits. But leaders who believe they are uniquely right feel justified in bypassing both. And The Simpsons imply that this mindset will define every major decision of the second term. Supporters in this vision celebrate decisiveness. They see strength where others see overreach. They applaud actions that finally get things done, especially after years of gridlock and frustration. To them, rules feel like excuses that held the country back. Opponents, however, see something else entirely. They see the erosion of norms, the bending of constitutional boundaries, the slow transformation of executive power into something heavier, more permanent, harder to reverse. And this is where the danger intensifies. Because when a leader is driven by vindication rather than consensus, every challenge becomes a test of dominance. Courts become obstacles. Legislatures become enemies. The press becomes an adversary. And governance turns into a continuous confrontation. The show doesn't say these choices will immediately destroy democracy. Instead, it suggests something more subtle, a grinding pressure. A constant strain that forces institutions to prove whether they are symbolic or resilient. And as that pressure builds, one truth becomes unavoidable. A second term shaped by personal vindication doesn't just test laws. It tests the system's ability to survive a leader who believes he alone understands what must be done. That realization naturally leads to the next question. What happens when legitimacy itself is questioned? When leadership is driven by certainty rather than restraint, legitimacy becomes the fragile ground beneath everything else. And this is where the story turns from personal psychology to collective fracture. Throughout different episodes, the future imagined by the show repeatedly returns to one unsettling idea: an election that does not truly end. Not because ballots aren't counted, but because belief is never restored. Maps appear on screen with states colored red and blue, but also gray. Unresolved, contested, suspended in uncertainty. A voice asks a question that sounds rhetorical, yet feels dangerously real. What happens when both sides claim victory? When courts are overwhelmed? When no authority can deliver an outcome everyone accepts? The implication is clear. The transition into 2025 does not bring closure. It brings doubt. In this version of events, the presidency begins under a cloud. Half the country views the leader as legitimate, chosen, restored. The other half sees him as imposed, enabled by a system they no longer trust. And once that divide hardens, governance becomes a battlefield before the first decision is even made. Every action is filtered through suspicion. Executive orders are not evaluated on their merits, but on their intent. Court rulings are interpreted as loyalty tests. Even neutral institutions are forced to pick sides simply by existing. What makes this scenario especially dangerous is that legitimacy, once lost, is almost impossible to regain. Laws still function, procedures are followed. But faith, the invisible glue that allows democracy to operate, begins to erode. The show suggests that this erosion doesn't happen dramatically. There is no single breaking moment. Instead, it unfolds quietly. Protests escalate. Rhetoric sharpens. Every compromise feels like betrayal to someone. And paralysis sets in just when decisive action is most needed. This is where the second term becomes uniquely volatile. A leader who believes he must act boldly feels justified in pushing forward, even without consensus. Meanwhile, opponents feel equally justified in resisting, even at the cost of dysfunction. Each side believes the other represents an existential threat. And in that standoff, the system itself is forced into the spotlight. Because democracy isn't tested when people agree. It's tested when disagreement becomes so intense that coexistence feels impossible. The show isn't predicting collapse, but it is predicting strain. Prolonged, exhausting strain. A nation that spends its energy questioning the legitimacy of its own leadership has little left to address anything else. And that vacuum doesn't remain empty for long. As internal conflict deepens, something else begins to shift. Not inside the country, but beyond its borders. As the nation struggles to govern itself, the world is not watching passively. This is one of the most subtle and unsettling warnings embedded in the show's vision of 2025. Political division does not stay contained within borders. It radiates outward. In several episodes, the Simpsons shift the camera away from America entirely. The setting changes. Foreign leaders sit around tables watching screens filled with American news. The tone is calm, calculated, almost detached. One leader speaks plainly. America is weakening itself from within. Another responds without hesitation. Then we wait. There is no urgency in their voices, no panic, only patience. The message is clear. When a superpower becomes consumed by internal conflict, it creates opportunity. Rivals do not need to provoke. They do not need to attack. They simply observe, knowing that distraction is a form of self-sabotage. The show suggests that this moment, a contested presidency layered on top of a legitimacy crisis, signals to the world that America's attention is divided, that its decision-making is slowed, that its alliances may no longer be reliable. Allies begin to hedge. They don't abandon the United States outright, but they prepare for uncertainty. They diversify partnerships. They delay commitments. Trust becomes conditional. Adversaries, meanwhile, grow bolder. Not recklessly, strategically. The show hints at moves taken just far enough to test boundaries. knowing that responses may be delayed or diluted by domestic chaos. Each unchallenged action shifts the balance slightly but permanently. What makes this phase particularly dangerous is that it rarely feels dramatic in the moment. There is no single headline announcing a collapse of global order. Instead, the world quietly adjusts. Power realigns. Influence shifts. And by the time the change is obvious, it is already established. The series is careful not to assign blame solely to leadership. It points to something broader, a system stretched thin by constant internal warfare. When every crisis at home becomes existential, the ability to respond effectively abroad diminishes. History supports this pattern. Periods of American political instability have often coincided with global realignment. The show isn't inventing this idea. It's reminding viewers that geopolitics rewards focus, coherence, and credibility, all of which become fragile in moments of deep division. And yet, even here, the tone is not apocalyptic. The implication is not that America disappears from the world stage, but that it temporarily loses its gravitational pull. The certainty that once anchored alliances begins to wobble, and that wobble accelerates change everywhere else. As the pressure builds, domestically and internationally, the question shifts once again. Not whether the system is under strain, but whether it can recover. And that leads directly into the final test the show presents. After all the tension, all the division, and all the quiet warnings, the story does not end in collapse. That may be the most surprising part of the message. The future shown after 2025 is not clean, not triumphant, and certainly not painless. But it is still standing. In scenes set years later, the country looks changed, scarred, wiser in ways it never wanted to be. The chaos has left marks on institutions, on communities, on trust itself. Yet America still exists, not because it avoided the crisis, but because it endured it. The show frames 2025 as a stress test rather than a prophecy of doom, a moment when every assumption about democracy is pushed to its limit, when the Constitution stops being an abstract idea and becomes something that must actively defend itself, through courts, through institutions, and ultimately through people. In one future scene, an older Lisa presents a lesson on leaders who tested democracy to its breaking point. She speaks calmly, without anger, without fear, and she says something that reframes everything that came before. People underestimated what happens when citizens truly understand what they stand to lose. That line matters, because it suggests the system didn't survive because leaders suddenly became wiser. It survived because the pressure forced awareness, forced engagement, forced responsibility. The series doesn't romanticize this awakening. It acknowledges the cost. Families divided, friendships broken, years of uncertainty, moments when it felt easier to give up than to keep believing in shared rules and imperfect institutions. And yet, those very struggles created something new. A generation less naive about power, less trusting of slogans, more aware that democracy is not self-sustaining. It demands attention, participation, and restraint, especially when emotions run high. There is also a quieter, more unsettling moment. A former leader, years after leaving office, is asked whether he regrets anything. His answer is simple, confident, unapologetic. He believes history will judge him fairly. That certainty remains intact. The show doesn't tell us whether he's right or wrong. Instead, it leaves that judgment where it belongs, with time. And that may be the final warning embedded in this story. The danger isn't certainty itself. It's certainty without self-doubt, conviction without reflection, leadership that never pauses to ask whether strength is serving the country or merely the ego. At the same time, the message to the public is just as clear. When crises arrive, real ones, not hypothetical, reactions matter as much as decisions. Blind opposition can paralyze just as easily as blind loyalty can enable excess. The future, the show suggests, is not predetermined. It is shaped by choices made under pressure. by whether leaders evolve when the moment demands it, and by whether citizens remain engaged even when democracy becomes uncomfortable, exhausting, and deeply imperfect. 2025, in this vision, is not the end of the story. It is the moment when pretending ends, when reality demands maturity. The warning has been delivered, not as fear but as preparation. What happens next is not written in animation frames or hidden jokes. It will be written by actions, reactions, and the collective willingness to face difficult truths instead of hiding from them.